The small town of Riverdale was known for its quiet streets and close-knit community. Most residents knew each other by name, and the crime rate was so low that the local newspaper often featured stories about lost pets on the front page. But beneath this peaceful facade, tensions had been brewing. The police department had faced accusations of racial profiling in recent years, with several incidents making headlines in nearby cities. Officer Patricia Wilson had served on the Riverdale police force for 15 years. She prided herself on her record, her dedication to the job, and what she called her intuition about potential troublemakers. This intuition, as she would later be forced to recognize, was often nothing more than deeply rooted prejudice that she had never confronted within herself. On a brisk Monday morning, Patricia was patrolling the downtown area when she noticed a tall black man in casual clothing standing outside the police department. He appeared to be taking photos of the building with his phone. In Patricia's mind, this immediately registered as suspicious behavior. She pulled her patrol car to the curb and stepped out, her hand resting instinctively on her holster. "Excuse me, sir," she called out, her voice carrying that authoritative edge she had perfected over the years. "What are you doing photographing a government building?" The man turned to face her, his expression calm and measured. "Good morning, officer," he replied, his voice deep and resonant. "I'm just familiarizing myself with the area." Patricia moved closer, scanning him with critical eyes. He was well dressed in business casual attire, dark pants and a light blue button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms. He wore no uniform, no badge, nothing to identify him as someone who had any business inspecting the police headquarters. "ID, please," Patricia demanded, not bothering to hide the suspicion in her voice. The man reached slowly into his back pocket and produced a wallet. "I don't see why that's necessary, but here you go." Patricia snatched the wallet from his hand, her movements unnecessarily aggressive. As she flipped it open to check his identification, she missed the flash of disappointment that crossed the man's face. "Robert Johnson," she read aloud, studying the driver's license photo and comparing it to the man standing before her. "You're not from Riverdale. What brings you to our town, Mr. Johnson?" "I have business here," he answered simply. His vague response only fueled Patricia's suspicion. In her 15 years on the force, she had encountered countless individuals who had business in Riverdale, drug dealers from neighboring counties, petty thieves looking for easy targets, troublemakers of all kinds. "What kind of business involves photographing a police station?" she pressed, her tone growing increasingly hostile. "I think that's my concern, officer," Robert replied, maintaining his composure despite her aggression. "I'm not breaking any laws by standing on a public sidewalk." Something about his calm demeanor, the way he looked directly into her eyes without fear or deference, triggered a surge of anger in Patricia. Who did this outsider think he was, challenging her authority in her own town? "Listen here," she snapped, stepping closer until she was uncomfortably close to him. "We don't appreciate strangers coming around taking pictures of our facilities. Could be reconnaissance for something illegal." Robert raised an eyebrow. "That's quite an assumption to make about someone you've just met, Officer Wilson," he said, glancing at her name tag. The fact that he had addressed her by name, a small shift in the power dynamic, pushed Patricia over the edge. In a moment that would soon change both their lives, she reached out and slapped him across the face, not hard enough to leave a mark, but with enough force to communicate her contempt. The sound of the slap seemed to echo in the morning air. Several passers-by stopped in their tracks, mouths agape. From inside the police station, faces appeared at windows. Robert didn't flinch. He didn't raise a hand to his cheek where her palm had connected. He simply looked at her with an expression that mixed disappointment with resolve. "Officer Wilson," he said quietly, "I think we should continue this conversation inside." Before Patricia could respond, the door to the police station flew open, and Chief Rogers hurried out, his face flushed with horror at what he had just witnessed from his office window. "Officer Wilson." "Stand down immediately," the chief bellowed, his voice cracking with urgency. Patricia turned, confused by her superior's intervention. "Chief, I was just questioning this suspicious individual who—" "Patricia, for God's sake," the chief cut her off, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. "This is Robert Johnson, the new police chief. He's starting today. I was about to introduce him to the department at the morning briefing." The blood drained from Patricia's face as the reality of the situation crashed down upon her. She turned back to Robert, seeing him now through new eyes, not as a suspicious outsider, but as her new boss, the man who would be leading the department and overseeing her career. I didn't." She stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence as the enormity of her mistake became clear. Robert straightened his shirt calmly. "Chief Rogers, thank you for the introduction, though it's not quite how I imagined meeting my new team." His voice was controlled, professional, betraying none of the humiliation he must have felt. "Officer Wilson, I believe we have a lot to discuss about appropriate conduct and the standards I expect in this department." As they walked into the station, Patricia felt the stares of her colleagues boring into her back. News would spread quickly in a department this size. By lunchtime, everyone would know what she had done. Her reputation, built over 15 years of service, had been shattered in a single impulsive moment. What she didn't yet realize was that this incident would not only change her career trajectory but would ultimately transform the entire Riverdale Police Department, and perhaps Patricia herself, in ways none of them could have anticipated. The walk into the police station felt like the longest journey of Patricia's life. Each step was heavy with the weight of her actions, her mind racing to find some explanation that could soften what she had done. But there was no excuse, no policy or procedure she could hide behind. She had slapped a civilian, who turned out to be her new boss, based on nothing but her own prejudice. Inside, the morning briefing room fell silent as Robert Johnson entered, followed by Chief Rogers and a visibly shaken Patricia. Officers who had been chatting over coffee straightened in their chairs, curious about the unfamiliar face but even more intrigued by Patricia's unusual demeanor. "Good morning, everyone," Chief Rogers began, his voice strained as he attempted to salvage the situation. "I'd like to introduce you all to Robert Johnson, your new police chief. As you know, I'm retiring next week, and Chief Johnson will be taking over effective immediately." Robert stepped forward, his presence commanding the room despite the red mark still visible on his cheek. "Thank you, Chief Rogers. I was hoping for a more traditional first day, but perhaps this is fitting." His eyes scanned the room, taking in the faces of his new team. "What happened outside provides us with an immediate opportunity to address some issues that clearly exist within this department." Patricia stared at the floor, feeling the curious glances from her colleagues. She had always been respected, feared, even, within the force. Now she stood exposed, her actions impossible to justify. "Officer Wilson and I will be having a private conversation after this briefing," Robert continued. "But I want to make something clear to everyone. What occurred today is a symptom of a larger problem that we will address together as a department. I didn't come to Riverdale to fire people or point fingers. I came here to build a police force that serves everyone in this community equally and with respect." After the briefing, Patricia followed Robert to what would now be his office. Chief Rogers had excused himself, leaving them alone. The silence between them was suffocating as Robert settled behind the desk and gestured for her to sit. 15 years on the force," Robert said, reviewing her file that lay open on the desk. "Numerous commendations. Not a single formal complaint filed against you." Patricia nodded stiffly, her throat too tight to speak. "But I wonder," he continued, "how many interactions like the one we had this morning occurred without being reported? How many citizens walked away feeling diminished, feeling targeted, but didn't file complaints because they didn't think it would matter?" His question hung in the air, requiring no answer because they both knew the truth. "I could fire you," Robert said plainly. "I have cause. Assaulting a civilian, because that's what I was to you at that moment, is grounds for immediate termination. Patricia finally found her voice. I understand, sir. And I wouldn't contest it. Robert studied her for a long moment. But termination is easy. It solves nothing. It doesn't address the culture that allowed you to feel comfortable approaching a situation that way. It doesn't help you understand the impact of your actions. He closed her file and leaned forward. So instead, Officer Wilson, I'm going to give you an assignment. One that might be harder than losing your job. Patricia looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time since the incident. Starting tomorrow, Robert said, you're being reassigned. And I think you'll find it's going to change your perspective in ways you never expected. The next morning, Patricia arrived at the station an hour early. She hadn't slept well, her mind replaying yesterday's events on an endless loop. The shame had settled into her bones, making her movements stiff as she changed into her uniform. She waited in Chief Johnson's office as instructed, dreading what this assignment might entail. When he walked in, he was carrying 2 cups of coffee and a folder tucked under his arm. Good morning, Officer Wilson, he said, setting 1 cup in front of her. I appreciate your punctuality. Patricia nodded, not touching the coffee. Sir, before you tell me my assignment, I want to apologize properly for my actions yesterday. There's no excuse for what I did. Robert took a seat across from her. No, there isn't. But acknowledgement is the first step. He opened the folder and slid it across the desk. Your new assignment starts today. You're being transferred to community outreach. Patricia flipped through the pages, confusion washing over her face. Community outreach? Sir, I'm a patrol officer. I don't have training for. The Riverdale East Community Center has requested police presence for their youth programs, Robert interrupted. They need someone to help build trust between local kids and law enforcement. Patricia's stomach dropped. Riverdale East was predominantly black and Hispanic, the part of town that officers typically visited only when responding to calls. It wasn't just outside her comfort zone, it was territory she had actively avoided throughout her career. Chief Johnson, I don't think I'm the right person for this. Maybe Officer Thompson or... You're exactly the right person, Robert said firmly. And that's precisely why you think you're not. He stood up and walked to the window overlooking the town. I did my research before coming to Riverdale. This department has a history of minimal engagement with certain communities. There's a divide that needs to be bridged. Patricia remained silent, the reality of her situation sinking in. You'll report to the center 3 days a week, helping with after-school programs. You'll be in plain clothes, but everyone will know you're a police officer. He turned to face her. The program director, Mrs. Washington, is expecting you at noon today. For how long? Patricia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 6 months, to start. Progress reports weekly. Robert returned to his desk. This isn't punishment, Officer Wilson. It's an opportunity for growth, yours and the department's. That afternoon, Patricia stood outside the community center, her palms sweaty. She had changed into civilian clothes as instructed, but she felt exposed without her uniform. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door. The center was bustling with activity. Children of various ages were scattered throughout the main hall, some doing homework, others playing games. A stern-looking older woman approached her immediately. You must be Officer Wilson, she said, her expression unreadable. I'm Beatrice Washington. Chief Johnson called to tell me you were coming. Patricia extended her hand. Yes, ma'am. I'm here to help with the youth programs. Mrs. Washington didn't take her hand. Let me be clear, officer. We agreed to this arrangement because Chief Johnson convinced me it could benefit our children. But I know what happened yesterday. Word travels fast in Riverdale. Patricia lowered her hand, shame coloring her cheeks. The children here don't need another authority figure who sees them as threats, Mrs. Washington continued. They need someone who sees their potential. So I have one question for you. Are you here because you have to be, or because you want to make a difference? It was a question Patricia wasn't prepared for, and one she didn't have an honest answer to, at least not yet. Under Mrs. Washington's unwavering gaze, Patricia struggled to find the right words. The truth was uncomfortable. She was here because she had to be, because the alternative was losing her job. But something in the older woman's eyes made her hesitate to give such a self-serving answer. I'm here because I need to be, Patricia finally said. I won't pretend this was my choice, but I'm willing to learn. Mrs. Washington studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly. Honesty. That's somewhere to start. She gestured for Patricia to follow her. Let me show you around. As they walked through the center, Patricia noticed details she hadn't expected. The building was worn but impeccably clean. Motivational posters and children's artwork covered the walls. Every room was purposeful, a library corner with well-used books, a computer lab with outdated but functional machines, a small kitchen where volunteers prepared healthy snacks. Most of our kids come here directly after school, Mrs. Washington explained. Many stay until 7 or 8 at night because their parents work late shifts. For some, this is the safest place they know. They stopped at the entrance to a small gymnasium where about a dozen boys were playing basketball. Their shouts and laughter echoed off the walls. You'll start here, Mrs. Washington said. Coach Thomas usually runs basketball practice, but he called in sick today. These boys need supervision. Patricia's eyes widened. You want me to coach basketball? Today? I don't know anything about. Figure it out, Mrs. Washington interrupted, her tone brooking no argument. These kids don't need a professional coach. They need an adult who cares enough to show up. With that, she walked away, leaving Patricia alone in the doorway. The game paused as the boys noticed her. They ranged in age from about 10 to 15, and all of them regarded her with curious, slightly suspicious expressions. Who are you? Asked one of the older boys, bouncing a basketball against his hip. Patricia took a deep breath. My name is Patricia Wilson. I'm here to help with basketball practice today. Where's Coach Thomas? Another boy asked. He's sick today. I'll be filling in. The boys exchanged glances, clearly unimpressed. One of them, a lanky teenager with bright, intelligent eyes, stepped forward. You know anything about basketball? He asked, skepticism evident in his voice. Patricia could have lied, could have pretended expertise to establish authority. But something told her these kids would see right through that. Honestly, not much, she admitted. But I'm willing to learn if you're willing to teach me. Surprised laughter rippled through the group. The boy who'd questioned her raised an eyebrow, then unexpectedly smiled. I'm Dion, he said. That's a first. An adult asking kids to teach them. Well, Dion, Patricia said, returning his smile cautiously, I figure you all know more about this game than I do. So how about you show me the basics, and then maybe I can help organize a proper match. Dion considered this, then tossed her the ball. Patricia caught it awkwardly. First lesson, he said, a hint of challenge in his voice, you gotta loosen up. You look like you're afraid the ball's gonna bite you. The other boys laughed, not unkindly. For the first time since the incident with Chief Johnson, Patricia felt the tight knot in her chest begin to ease slightly. She bounced the ball experimentally, surprised when the boys made space for her to join their circle. Okay, Dion, she said. Show me what to do. 2 weeks into her assignment, Patricia had fallen into an uneasy routine. She spent her mornings on regular patrol duty and her afternoons at the community center. The transition between these two worlds was jarring, from the familiar comfort of her patrol car to the chaotic energy of the center, where she still felt like an outsider. Basketball sessions with Dion and the other boys had become the highlight of her time there. She was learning the game, but more importantly, she was learning their names, their personalities, their stories. Dion, she discovered, was raising his younger siblings while his mother worked 2 jobs. Another boy, Anthony, had dreams of becoming an engineer despite his struggling grades. Today, Patricia arrived at the center to find Mrs. Washington waiting for her with a troubled expression. "There's a situation," Mrs. Washington said without preamble. "Dion didn't show up for school today, and his mother can't leave work to look for him. She's worried." Patricia felt a surprising twinge of concern. Did something happen? There was an incident yesterday. Some officers stopped him and his friends while they were walking home. Searched them on the sidewalk, made them empty their pockets. Nothing came of it, but Dion was upset. Patricia's stomach tightened. She knew exactly what kind of stop Mrs. Washington was describing. She had conducted hundreds of them herself. "Do you know where he might go?" Patricia asked. His mother mentioned an abandoned lot near Maple Street where the boys sometimes hang out. Patricia nodded. "I'll find him." She drove to the location in her personal car, parking at a distance before approaching on foot. The lot was overgrown, with a makeshift basketball hoop, a milk crate nailed to a plywood board, attached to a fence. Dion sat alone on a concrete block, idly bouncing a worn basketball. He looked up as she approached, his expression hardening. "Did Mrs. Washington send you to find me?" "She's worried." "So is your mom," Patricia said, keeping her distance. "Mind if I sit?" Dion shrugged, which Patricia took as permission to perch on another block nearby. "I heard about what happened yesterday," she said after a moment of silence. "Yeah?" Dion's voice was tight. "Probably no big deal to you. Just another day, right?" Patricia felt the jab but didn't deflect it. "Tell me what happened. From your perspective." Dion looked surprised at the request, then suspicious. "Why?" "Because I want to understand." He studied her face, as if searching for insincerity. Finding none, he began to speak. He described walking home with friends, the patrol car slowing beside them, the officer's aggressive questions, the humiliation of being searched in public while neighbors watched. "They didn't find anything because there wasn't anything to find," Dion said, anger and hurt breaking through his usually confident demeanor. "But it doesn't matter. They'll do it again next week, and the week after that." Patricia listened without interrupting, without defending, without explaining away. For the first time, she was hearing the other side of a story she had been part of creating. "You know what the worst part is?" Dion continued, meeting her eyes directly. "I wasn't even surprised. That's messed up, right? 14 years old, and I already expect to be treated like a criminal." His words hung in the air between them, challenging Patricia to really hear them. And for the first time, she did. "It is messed up," she said quietly. "And I'm sorry that happened to you, Dion." The simple acknowledgement seemed to catch him off guard. He bounced the ball once, twice, then asked, "If you were the chief, what would you do differently?" It was exactly the question Patricia had been asking herself ever since meeting Robert Johnson. Patricia considered Dion's question carefully. It wasn't hypothetical anymore. It was about real policies affecting real people, this boy sitting in front of her, his friends, this community. "I'd start by making sure officers understand that their job is to protect everyone, not just some people," she finally said. "And I'd want them to know the community they're serving. Really know it." Dion seemed unimpressed. "That's just words, though." "You're right," Patricia admitted. "Actions matter more. So I'd change how officers are evaluated. Not by how many arrests they make or tickets they write, but by how safe people feel with them around. She paused, realizing she meant every word. And I'd make sure that when officers mess up, they're held accountable. No exceptions. Dion bounced the ball thoughtfully. That's what the new chief is trying to do, isn't it? I heard about what happened, with you and him. Patricia's face flushed with embarrassment. Of course the story had spread throughout the community. Yeah, she said quietly. That's what he's trying to do. Is that why you're here? He making you do community service or something? Patricia almost denied it, but caught herself. It started that way, she admitted. But it's becoming something else now. For a while, they sat in silence, the only sound the rhythmic bounce of Dion's basketball against the cracked concrete. I should get back, Dion finally said. My mom will be worried. I can drive you home, Patricia offered. To her surprise, Dion accepted with a small nod. The drive was quiet until they were nearly at Dion's apartment building. Those officers yesterday, Dion said suddenly. Would you report them? If you saw what they did? Before her time at the center, Patricia would have defended her colleagues without hesitation. Now, the answer wasn't so simple. I would, she said, surprising herself with her certainty. It wasn't right, what they did to you and your friends. Dion studied her face, as if checking for lies. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded once before getting out of the car. See you tomorrow, Ms. Wilson. The next morning, Patricia requested a meeting with Chief Johnson. When she entered his office, she found him reviewing case files. Officer Wilson, he greeted her, gesturing to the chair across from him. Your first progress report isn't due until next week. I know, sir. This isn't about the report. She took a deep breath. It's about an incident that occurred 2 days ago. Some officers conducted unwarranted searches on a group of minors walking home from school in the East Side neighborhood. Robert looked up, his expression unreadable. Do you have the officers' names or badge numbers? No, sir. But I'd like to file a formal complaint anyway, based on the account I received. From whom? One of the boys at the community center. Dion Taylor. He's 14. Robert leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. You understand what you're doing, Officer Wilson? Filing a complaint against fellow officers based on a civilian report? Patricia met his gaze steadily. Yes, sir. I do. And you believe this boy's account? I do. And I believe those officers need better training on when searches are appropriate and how to interact with minors. A hint of approval flickered across Robert's face. I'll look into it. In the meantime, how's your assignment going? Patricia thought about Dion, about the basketball games, about Mrs. Washington's watchful eyes. It's educational, sir. Good, Robert said with a small smile. That's exactly what it's supposed to be. Word spread quickly through the police department that Patricia Wilson had filed a complaint against fellow officers. The cold shoulders and whispered comments in the break room made it clear that many viewed her as a traitor. Her locker was vandalized with the word snitch scratched into the metal. Someone even moved her desk into the hallway while she was at the community center. Patricia had expected the backlash, but the reality of it still stung. These were people she'd worked alongside for years, had barbecues with, attended weddings and funerals with. Now they treated her like she'd broken some sacred code. Just ignore them, advised Officer Rodriguez, one of the few who still spoke to her. They'll get over it eventually. But Patricia wasn't sure she wanted them to get over it if it meant returning to the way things were before. Something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of what it meant to be a police officer. That afternoon at the community center, Patricia noticed a new face. A man in his early 30s sat with Mrs. Washington, deep in conversation. As Patricia approached, she realized with surprise that it was Chief Johnson. "Officer Wilson," he greeted her. "Mrs. Washington was just telling me about the progress you've been making here." Patricia glanced at Mrs. Washington, expecting her usual stern expression. Instead, the older woman gave her a small nod that felt remarkably like approval. "The children respond to her," Mrs. Washington confirmed. "Especially since she helped Dion last week." Before Patricia could respond, the gymnasium doors burst open and several of the kids rushed in, Dion among them. "Ms. Wilson. We made the playoffs," Dion announced excitedly, then stopped short when he noticed Chief Johnson. Recognition flickered across his face. "You're the new police chief," Dion said cautiously. "The one who got slapped." Robert laughed, the sound surprisingly warm. "That's one way to remember me. And you must be Dion. I've heard a lot about you." Dion looked between Patricia and Robert, understanding dawning on his face. "You told him about what happened with those cops?" Patricia nodded. "I did. And Chief Johnson is looking into it." "Actually," Robert said, "that's partly why I'm here today. Those officers have been temporarily reassigned to desk duty pending an investigation. And we're implementing new training protocols for interacting with minors." The surprise on Dion's face mirrored what Patricia felt. She hadn't expected such swift action. "Really?" Dion asked skeptically. "Really," Robert confirmed. "Your statement was taken seriously, Dion. And it's going to help make changes." Later, as they watched the boys practice, Robert turned to Patricia. "The complaint you filed caused quite a stir at the station." Patricia sighed. "I know. I'm not exactly popular right now." "Doing the right thing rarely makes you popular," Robert said. "But it does make you a good officer." He paused. "And I have another assignment for you, if you're willing." Patricia looked at Chief Johnson with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Another assignment?" "I'm forming a community relations task force," he explained. "Officers dedicated to building bridges between the department and neighborhoods that have historically distrusted police. I want you to lead it." Patricia was speechless. Just weeks ago, she'd been the last person who should lead such an initiative. Now, Chief Johnson was suggesting she was the most qualified. "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but most of the department isn't speaking to me right now. How would I lead anything?" "That's exactly why you're the right person," Robert said. "You've experienced both sides now. You understand the resistance within the department, and you've seen firsthand the impact of poor policing on communities like this one." He gestured toward the gym where the boys were playing. "The officers who join this task force will be volunteers who share your commitment to change." Patricia watched Dion expertly dribbling between defenders. 3 months ago, she might have seen him as suspicious if she'd encountered him on the street. Now she saw a bright kid with potential, responsible beyond his years, taking care of his siblings while his mother worked multiple jobs. "I'd like to think about it," she said finally. Robert nodded. "Take the weekend. Let me know on Monday." That evening, Patricia drove home deep in thought. At a red light, she noticed a patrol car pull over a young black man in a hoodie who was simply walking down the sidewalk. She watched as the officer made him put his hands against the wall, patting him down while the young man's face showed a familiar mixture of anger and resignation. Without thinking, Patricia pulled over and approached, badge in hand. "Evening, officer," she said pleasantly to her colleague, Officer Bryant. "Everything okay here?" Bryant looked surprised to see her. "Just a routine stop, Wilson." Guy was acting suspicious. Patricia observed the young man, who was dressed in hospital scrubs under his hoodie. "Sir, do you work at Riverdale General?" she asked him. "Yes, ma'am. Just got off my shift." "I'm a nurse in the ER," he replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. Patricia turned back to Bryant. "Officer, I believe this gentleman is just heading home from work. Unless you have specific reason to believe he's committed a crime, he should be free to go." Bryant's face hardened. "Since when do you question how other officers conduct their stops, Wilson?" "Since I started paying attention to the impact they have," she replied evenly. "Have a good night, Officer Bryant." She turned to the nurse. "I apologize for the inconvenience, sir. Are you all right?" The man looked at her with surprise that slowly turned to cautious appreciation. "I'm fine. Thank you." As Patricia drove away, she knew her decision was made. The task force wouldn't be easy. She'd face resistance from colleagues, skepticism from the community, and her own continuing education. But for the first time in her career, she felt like she was truly serving and protecting everyone, not just some. 6 months later, the Riverdale Police Department hosted an open house for the community. The station's lobby had been transformed with information booths, refreshments, and activities for children. Officers mingled with residents in a relaxed atmosphere that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. Patricia stood near the entrance, now wearing the insignia of a sergeant. Her promotion had come with her new role leading the Community Relations Task Force, a team that had grown from 3 reluctant volunteers to 12 dedicated officers. "Quite a turnout," Chief Johnson remarked, joining her. "Your team did good work here." Patricia nodded, watching as Officer Rodriguez demonstrated how police equipment worked to a group of fascinated children. Nearby, Officer Bryant, who had surprised everyone by requesting to join the task force after his encounter with Patricia, was deep in conversation with a community elder. "It's a start," Patricia replied. "We have a long way to go." "Progress isn't measured in finish lines," Robert said. "It's measured in changed minds. Speaking of which..." He gestured toward the door where Mrs. Washington had just entered, accompanied by Dion and several other teenagers from the community center. Patricia smiled as Dion approached, noticing how he'd grown taller in just half a year. "Didn't think I'd ever see you voluntarily walking into a police station," she teased. Dion shrugged, but his small smile was genuine. "Mrs. Washington said we should check it out. See if you're really doing what you said you would." "And what's the verdict?" Chief Johnson asked. Dion looked around thoughtfully. "It's different. Not perfect, but different." Mrs. Washington nodded in agreement. "Change takes time, but we recognize the effort." As they spoke, Patricia noticed a commotion near one of the information booths. Officer Daniels, one of the few who had refused to work with the task force, was engaged in a heated exchange with a young mother whose child had accidentally knocked over a display. "Excuse me," Patricia said, quickly moving to intervene before the situation escalated. "Everything all right here?" she asked, positioning herself between Officer Daniels and the family. "This woman needs to control her kid," Daniels said tersely. The mother, clearly embarrassed, was trying to quiet her upset toddler while picking up the scattered papers. "I'm so sorry. He just got excited and..." "It's no problem at all," Patricia interrupted with a reassuring smile. "That's what kids do. Here, let me help." She knelt down to help gather the materials, then turned to Daniels with a firm but professional tone. "Officer, why don't you check if they need assistance at the recruitment table?" After Daniels reluctantly left, Patricia helped the mother and child find the children's activities area, making sure they felt welcome despite the incident. When she returned, she found Chief Johnson watching her with approval. "That's why you're leading this initiative," he said. 6 months ago, you might have been Officer Daniels." Patricia couldn't deny it. 6 months ago, I slapped a stranger for taking pictures of the police station. And now? She looked around at the station transformed, not just the decorations for the open house, but the fundamental shift in how officers were beginning to interact with the public. Dion was showing his friends the inside of a patrol car, an officer patiently explaining how the equipment worked. "Now I understand what you meant that first day," Patricia said. About termination being the easy option. This, changing a department from within, changing myself, that's the harder assignment. Robert smiled. The hardest assignments often matter most. As the event continued around them, Patricia reflected on her journey from that pivotal morning 6 months ago. One mistake had nearly ended her career, but instead had transformed it into something more meaningful than she could have imagined. She still had daily reminders of how far she had to go, the occasional slip into old thinking patterns, resistance from colleagues, skepticism from community members with long memories. But when Dion caught her eye across the room and gave her a small nod of acknowledgement, Patricia knew she was finally on the right path.